Very well. I'm delighted to be in Atlanta, which is my second home. I'm also delighted as a Canadian to be in Atlanta in November. Just recently, my wife and I were on the east coast of Georgia for a series of lectures that I was giving there. And the person who was touring the area used the words pool, beach, and November in the same line. And my wife leaned over and said, that's a first for us. But it's a delight. Emory is a second home to me, and it's always great to come back to so many friends and family here in Atlanta. So today we'll be looking at the theology of the body, which I suspect that some of you are familiar with. Are any of you not familiar with the theology of the body? Oh, good. So let's start from the beginning, right? I won't start from there, but. Well, in 1979 to about 1984, St. John Paul II, during his Wednesday audiences that were delivered, if ever you've been to Rome, maybe St. Peter's Basilica, on Wednesday there's an audience from the Pope, and so the Pope will speak usually to the people gathered there, or in the Paul VI Forum, where I was just there actually a few weeks ago, and he would come out and give these addresses. And for about 5 years, he gave addresses that touched on the Catholic vision of the body. For 5 years, he gave 129 about addresses, and those addresses were all collected into kind of a compendium that summarized the Catholic teaching on the body. We call it Theology of the Body. And it was divided into 5 sections. The first was on foundations, what it means to be a human person, and that's what I'm going to start with today. And then he talked about anthropology. He talked about what it means to be a human person before and after the fall, right? As a sinful people, what does it mean? What does that mean for the human condition? He talked about what we call the eschatological body, which you can just use to impress your friends, right? That kind of language. But eschatology is the study of the end. Eschaton is the Greek word for the end. So when we talk about death and the afterlife, that's eschatology. So we talked about the resurrection body and so on and so forth and the dignity of that, which I'd like to get to. That's my interest in theology of the body. And then he went on to talk about the sacrament of marriage and the transmission of human life. Those are the major sections of the theology of the body. And most people look to the theology of the body mostly for the sexual ethics teaching of the church, right? But I'd like to be a little bit broader today and speak about the dignity of the human body. That's very much the foundation of that. So in my day, I was a catechist and head of faith education in my diocese, in the English region of my diocese on the south shore of Montreal. And my mandate, my ministry was with children mostly, and then my mandate became to educate the parents of the children, because the parents were quite distant from the tradition where we're from. People are more and more distant from the Catholic tradition, even though Quebec was called the cradle of Catholicism in North America in her day, and now the cradle of lapsed Catholicism in the world, over the span of a generation. And so now our churches are emptying, they're being turned into condominiums, and that's no longer a horror for us. We see this all the time, right? And it's now a well-known reality that our churches are emptying, and that it's a whole new vision, right, of what Catholicism might mean in a place where we are rather hyper-secularized. Does that make sense to you? Whether you want to accept that or not, it's something different. So this is where I found myself. I was 19 when I was made director of faith education. The church, I suspect, was desperate in her need and had no one else. But there I was in my fancy jogging suit on my first day of work, ready to go. But my mandate was even in my youth, was to teach parents, because they didn't know what to say to their kids when it came to religion and faith. We just don't talk about that kind of thing where we are. That's where I come from, right? And we can chat perhaps at the end of my little talk if you have any specific questions about teaching kids or being in the family and how does this all translate. I'm happy to have those conversations because I've had many of them. But I just want to start with this. This is a line that comes not from the magisterium. This comes from a famous only to me, Canadian psychologist named Steven Pinker. He says, people don't generally engage in moral reasoning, but moral rationalization. They begin with the conclusion, coughed up by an unconscious emotion, and then work backward to a plausible justification. That's very academic and wordy. I won't be doing this tonight. But do you understand what he's saying here? He's saying that very often we are very quick to say, I am for or against. Abortion, contraception, euthanasia, you name the issue, I'm a bioethicist, this is my life, this is what I deal with. But people are very, very quick to say what it is that where they find themselves on the line. But then when you ask why, there's a lot of stumbling. Why does the church teach this, and why are you with that? Well, right, this is kind of what we see. And so I think my role, certainly as a catechist, as a professor, and so on and so forth, is to go back to the roots of the tradition to say, yeah, why is it that we believe what we believe? Do you follow me? Good, because here's something about following. Here's a Latin expression that I use all the time that comes from our own tradition. It is Thomistic. And it's one that you can use, again, to impress your friends. So I've given you two things, and that's probably going to be it, that you can use to impress your people. But this Latin expression, agere sequitur esse, means I act according to who I am. It's not rocket science, right? It means I act according to what I believe. And so this is what I think about these particular issues. And they're based in my belief system. And so what I want to do with you today is kind of crack open the dignity of the human body teaching that is part of theology of the body. Is that okay? To give you some equipment, I think, to have some conversations. Parfait. So let's begin as the Pope began in his collection, right? One of the first questions the Pope asks is, what is a person? Now, this is an ancient question. You'll remember this famous passage, or not famous, I don't know, a famous passage from the book of Psalms, right, chapter 8. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? Mortals, that you care for them. Right, this is, you can imagine what you might say when you look up at the universe, right? When you look up at the stars, I'm sure you've done this before, and you think, oh, what am I in the grandeur of all things? And why does God care for me, one in the billions? The question was asked a few years ago, right? And it's still asked today. So what am I exactly? In the world around us, this is, I think, important. Personhood is at the center of everything. When you ask people their opinions about abortion, or euthanasia, or contraception, or aging, Alzheimer's disease, this is an area that I study very closely. Even, what about the moral status of animals, stem cells, right? All of these interesting questions. The primary thing that we need to be thinking about is what it means to be a person. Because your answer to that will help guide your discussion in these big debates. You follow me? It really comes down to what you actually think about what a person is before you can start talking about what you think about abortion and contraception and so on and so forth. That's where it all starts, for me anyway. But what I want to impress on you, and I can send these slides to Andy in case any of you want to look over them again, because I'll go through them rather quickly. But what I want to impress on you is that we've been very selective about who counts as a human person. Because in our world, not all human beings count as persons. Personhood is a category of protection. If you're a person, you get certain protections. Are you okay with that? Right? That's how it is. In the Catholic tradition, if you're a human person, if you're a human being, you're also a person, ipso facto, period. But in the world around us, that is not the case. So there are some human beings who do not count as persons. Can you give me an example? Sorry? The fetus is a good example of that, right? We decide when you become a person, and that's a huge contention. And that, you've just showed us, is why personhood is at the very root of the discussion around abortion. Anyone else? People in persistent vegetative states. In fact, the Pope, I'm so happy that you bring this up, the Pope, Pope John Paul II, in his time, gave an address to physicians about persistent vegetative state. Do you know about this condition? And he said, I think it's abominable that we use the word vegetative to describe people. At no time do you ever become a vegetable. That is not Christian language. Talk about personhood. And there are others. We can count Alzheimer's disease. This is, just as an aside, I started in the Faculty of Medicine. I took my degree in anatomy and cell biology. As you can see, that's where I was headed. And in my degree, my grandmother, who I was really, really close to, developed Alzheimer's disease. And the people around me, I think trying to comfort, trying to give me solace, often said, she's no longer the person you once knew, Cory. And I realize this is difficult, but you stop going to class. I notice you're not going to class anymore, and that you're really sad, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this was kind of interesting. I actually ended up taking most of my electives, which should have been in chemistry and physiology, in ethics and religion, because that was the place where I could ask questions about what exactly is a person then. I ended up writing I took a master's in bioethics because I didn't want to leave my training in medicine nor my training in religion bounded in the study of bioethics, which looks at ethical issues in medicine from a religious perspective, and wrote my thesis on whether or not patients with Alzheimer's could still be considered persons. It is interesting how the vulnerable body may very well reorient your entire life. Let's see how we've been selective with the way that we name human beings, or not name human beings persons. The US Supreme Court ruled in 1857 that black people were not persons, and decided in the very famous Roe versus Wade case in 1973 that the unborn were not persons. Do you see that? The selective bestowal of personhood. Now, what are the criteria? We'll get back to that. But you can imagine who's writing these texts. This is fascinating to me. The law did recognize, however, that entities such as corporations, partnerships, or at times the collection of property were considered to be persons entitled to the legal rights and protections that the Constitution afforded any white American male. Selective bestowal of protection. C'est bien. Sorry, I slipped into French. Are you all with me? Let me just use the Canadian context. I know because it's my own, but you can certainly make the parallel. It was only in the last century, and it always stuns me that it was in 1929, that's not that long ago in human history, that Canadian women were legally declared. It's about the same, I think, in the US. It was a few years, I think, before us. That women were legally declared persons. The term up until then in legal text was synonymous with human male, thereby becoming eligible to appointment in the Senate. This is great. Read this. Great in a terrible way. Beforehand, British common law claimed that women were persons in the matter of pains and penalties, but not in the matter of rights and privileges. Hence, they had not been full-fledged members of the community of persons unless they did something wrong. Selective bestowal of personhood, right? The Church's wisdom on personhood and what it means to be a human person, and we draw this out of the theology of the body, is very rich and quite different from the culture in which we live. If I may, dignity is given to those who function, or who have certain functions and function well. Do you follow me? When you start losing those functions, you start losing your dignity. That's not our belief. That's the belief of the world around us that says that personhood is given to those who function. Therefore, the fetus doesn't count until X, right, when certain functions become apparent, and therefore dignity is only allotted then. It's called a hyper-functionalist definition of personhood. And it's why I was always interested in Alzheimer's disease. Because there's a certain point where you start with all of your functions intact, and then you start losing them. And my question was, well, at what point do people think you no longer count? And if you no longer count, then what care do we owe you? Right? These difficult questions. The Church is what we call physicalist, and I'm just throwing out these words to impress you. The Church is called physicalist. It means that she believes that from the moment of conception you count as a person, from the moment of the union of the gametes where suddenly we have a unique organism, you have dignity. You are entitled protection. You're entitled to a certain kind of respect. Now, a lot of people confuse that and think that that means that everyone has equal rights across the board, and that's not what the Church is saying. We don't think that the fetus has the same right to vote that you and I do, right? There are different rights, but there's a certain right to life that is protected under Catholic canon about these things. And why? Because we believe that all human beings count as persons from the beginning to the end, because you're made in the image and likeness of God, not when you're 11 or 15, but from the very beginning. Right, the mingling, the union of the sexes, right, and the marital union brings together a new life by God's grace. And in that moment, you are made in the image and likeness of God, even though you look not so much like a person like me. C'est bien? I remember that a student of mine just about 3 weeks ago, I teach in a secular university that has a very rich Catholic history that people forget. It's about a 400-year-old university, and when I was appointed professor of theology there, I still received a Latin scroll from the Vatican, from the Department of Education, saying, we give you permission to teach in theology. Cory Andreas, that's how they named me, because it was Latin. They didn't translate my first name. I guess it doesn't work out. But this secular university brings together healthcare professionals and so on and so forth. And one of my students said, well, professor, at the end of the day, one of the reasons why we believe that the fetus doesn't really have rights and dignity and so on and so forth is that it's just a collection of cells. The zygote is just a collection of cells. How many times have you heard this? And I said, yeah, I can buy that biologically, but I also am just a collection of cells. So at what point did I count? Right? At what point does the collection of cells start counting? It's like, well, I'm like, sit down. So interesting, how this works out. I'm not usually that, yeah, I am mostly that awful. So we believe in the inherent dignity of humankind from the moment, right, from the moment of conception to the very end. And that's easy for me to say. It's a little bit difficult to make manifest. It's difficult to be the grandson of a grandmother who can no longer speak to you because she's in advanced Alzheimer's disease and she's laying in a bed where you're not so sure, where you're quite sure she doesn't remember you, at least explicitly, and yet you're sitting there waiting for some kind of response. To think that this woman still has the same inherent dignity that she had when she carried you in her arms. Right? The body in Catholic theology is more than just a collection of cells. Yes? From the letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. I will not be dominated by anything. The body is meant for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord and will also raise us by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Anyone united to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you? You've heard this line probably 100 times. Which you have from God, and that you are not your own. For you are bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body. That's the scriptural context of the theology of the body. This is the one that we always talk about in this teaching. Why? Because I think the world around us, which is hypersexualized and hyperfunctional and all these hyper things, forgets that the body is more than just a clump of cells, more than just some stuff that you can throw here and there and do as you will. In fact, the culture around us believes that we are masters, or that we are entitled to be masters of the body. Do you hear this language? Right? We are in control of our own body. This is my body. I choose what to do with it. Jews, Christians, and Muslims, all of the great monotheistic traditions, believe that this is not only not our body, but that our body is on loan from God. And so, I don't know how it works in the United States, but in Canada, when you rent an apartment building, you are pretty much limited to what you can do in that building. I suspect it's probably the same here, right? So you can't knock down a wall without asking the proprietor for permission. It's an interesting parallel with the body. Right? Now, not that you call up God saying, hey, can I do the following things? That's not how it works. Now, even though the culture around us does tell us that we're the master of our bodies, that's also not so true. I suspect if you went to Emory University Hospital and said, listen, I'm no longer interested in this arm, please remove it. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but actually there are some interesting cases that we can talk about some other time, and a variety of conditions that are attached to that I'll leave on the side for now. But if you were to appear to a clinician and say, I don't want my arm anymore, and they studied and found out that there was nothing pathological about the arm, that the arm was healthy, they would not say, well, it's your body, come on in, we'll take care of that. They would not say that. So there is a limitation, right, to some of these things. I use that as probably a rather awful example, but you follow me. I hope that helps. The body, we have a lot of body language in the tradition. Everyone, outside thinks that Catholics are totally anti-sex and anti-body. That's it's quite the opposite. Not that we are like, we have these pancartes that say pro-sex, that's not how we do things, of course. But we have a very different rendering of the sexual union. We have a very different rendering of the material body. And what's interesting is that you see this in most of our great texts. One of my favorite passages, I'll probably say that a few times tonight, but one of my favorite passages in Scripture is Genesis 3:8. And in Genesis 3:8, you'll remember Adam and Eve are just created now. They are alone in the garden. And you're told that God is now walking in the cool of the afternoon. It's a beautiful image. You have this God who is in the flesh, right? It's an anthropomorphism of God. He is now walking through the garden, enjoying the cool breeze. It must have been more of a Canadian kind of garden than it was a southern, but there you are. And in that stroll, he starts looking for Adam and Eve. They hear him coming, and so they hide. Remember, this is just after the whole eating of the fruit. We don't know what kind of fruit it was, but they eat the fruit and they hide because they are suddenly alert to their nakedness and so on and so forth. And this is where God, of course, appears to them and says, hey, why are you I'm paraphrasing the Hebrew. Hey, why are you hiding? And they say, because we're naked. And God, in his good paternity, like every good parent, I have a 3 and a 1-year-old, I'll show you a picture of them in a second, knows very well, the next question, right, is the parent asking the child, well, how did you know that? And they said, we we ate the fruit that you told us not to eat. And God immediately turns to Adam. Didn't I tell you not to? And Adam says the immortal words, the woman who you gave me made me eat it. That's an interesting play on relationships, and it's also the wrong thing to say to God. And so, he turns to the woman, and she says, the snake made me do it, and the snake shrugs its shoulders and says, yeah, sorry about that. And then the curses begin in reverse form. So it's actually quite awful. But you see this God who encounters his people in the flesh. You see it also in, the doctrine of the incarnation, which is the center of Christianity, the scandal of a God who on high chooses to assume the body's form, the flesh of limitation, the flesh of fragility, and the flesh that will die. He chooses to take a life of suffering, and this is scandalous for the other worlds, for the religions of the world, that a God would ever choose this out of love. It's the center of Christianity. You know the word incarnation, of course. Carne, from the good Latin word, right, for flesh. Like chili con carne, which means, chili with meat, with flesh. It'll help you remember. It's what I use with my young kids, that's how I teach them. The ministry of Jesus we'll come back to is full of touching and the body and corporeality. The Passover meal, when Jesus changes the elements, right, of his own into the body and blood of, this is what we celebrate every Eucharist. Everything is very, very bodily. And of course, the resurrection. We do believe, of course, that it is this body that will come back to its own. It's not another body that we get somewhere else. It's the body that you now have, which is why the church is so interested in how we use the body in the here and now. It will be glorified in its time. But a lot of people, talk about the resurrection as you becoming an angel and so on and so forth. But Catholic tradition teaches that the body will sleep until it's time, that it will be raised up, and the soul that it had originally will be replaced in that same body that is now glorified, right? And what that means is up for your imagination, of course. Jesus' ministry is so bodily. This is why he got into so much trouble. He touched a lot of people that he should not have. This is a beautiful Caravaggio. This is not a Caravaggio, but it looks like one. This is a painting of Jesus. Do you see him there with his hand in the air? In front of him, a person suffering from leprosy. Do you see that? He's in a hole in the ground. Do you see the wood that has been taken out to let him free? In the distance, you can't quite see it, I don't think, but there's the city. This guy who looked like the Walking Dead was not allowed in the city of the living because in Jewish law, as you well know, you don't mix the living and the dead. This is why in Jewish dietary law, you don't eat milk and meat. Milk, the symbol of life, meat, the symbol of death. You do not mix the two together. And in real life, neither. You don't put the living with the walking dead. The cemeteries go outside, and if you have certain contagion, diseases of the skin often, you are thrown outside also. And so not only were you sick, you were excommunicated. And Jesus' healing stories are often about him reaching out, which he should never have done, according to law, to touch, to heal, to speak. And the healing stories are never about the physical healing. They're always about a Jesus who is concerned about restoring people to the living community. So let me end with a few comments here. So at what point does the body acquire dignity? That's the huge debate in secular culture around us, right? And so if you don't believe that dignity starts from the beginning, which Catholics do, if you don't believe that, then the question becomes, well, then at what point? What are your criteria? What functions do you count as being dignified? Are you all with me? Well, for us, it starts from the beginning. This is one of my one of my favorite passages from the book of the prophet Jeremiah. This passage is used in Catholic circles and Christian circles, also in Jewish circles, often when a couple loses a child, sometimes in miscarriage, a word that I loathe. I think the word miscarriage needs to be changed. It seems to imply that the woman did not do something right. Do you see that? I think we have to be very attentive to the words we use, by the way. And people who suffer miscarriages, the church usually uses the funeral rites for children, but this is something that's often read. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. A dignity that is sealed on us before we are fleshed. In infancy, let the children come to me. I love that story. Now that I have small children, I always tell them to stay with me, lest they make people uncomfortable, or they ruin my reputation, or whatever it might be. So I always tell them to stay. And you know the story where Jesus says, no, let them come and sit. I'll tell them a story, right? There's something beautiful about the dignity in infancy. The church, in her wisdom, teaches that you come into your age, the age of reason, when you're in your 7th year. Not in your 25th year with a doctorate or something. Your 7th year. For those of you who know children, you might think it's actually a little younger. These are my 2 little ones. Oh, so cute. The dignity that is sealed on children. As a parent, for those of you who are parents or grandparents, or for those of you who know children, that's all you need, right? There is a different way of being mother and father without having a biological children. We are all mothers and fathers in some way. But you know this. There is something very graceful. There's something very powerful about little ones and knowing that there's a dignity there. Dignity in illness. This interests me as a medical ethicist. You know, what do we do with the sick? We do not distance ourselves. We anoint them with holy oils, no less. We don't discard them. We don't leave them aside. We anoint them. We stand by them. We're really, really bad with being present in silence, but we're called to do that. Dignity in despair, right? The body that's in despair. This is Elijah. Do you know the story of Elijah when he's just fed up and sits under a broom tree and says, okay, Father, take my life from me. I love this passage. He says, take my life from me. I'm not worthy. I'm not dignified of anything. Certainly not any more than my ancestors. And so he falls asleep and wakes for God to take his life. And instead he is tapped, I'm paraphrasing, he is tapped on the shoulder, and the angel of God leaves a cake and water at his feet and says, eat. And he says, no, thank you, and goes back to sleep. And the angel of the Lord knocks on his shoulder, taps on his shoulder and says, eat and drink, for the journey will be long. And this happens over and over until he says, okay, fine. This is what prophets do. This is how they respond usually. And he eats and drinks and he goes on his way, reminding us that even in despair, it is God who rises, right? It is God who raises. And at the same time, he does it through an instrument that is hard to say always who that instrument might be, right? But there's always somebody who is the instrument of God's raising of the body in despair. The body in weakness, also dignified. This looks like the Pietà, if you know the very famous Pietà in St. Peter's Basilica where Mary is holding the body of Jesus. Do you know that very famous statue? This looks like that, but it's actually Adam and Eve holding the body of Abel, the first son to die, the first person to die in Scripture. And what do we know about dignity and weakness? Do you remember the story about Cain? What happens about Cain? Yeah, you know this, where God comes to Cain and says, where is your brother? Again, a fatherly God who says, where is your brother? As if he does not know, right? And Cain says, oh, I don't know, am I my brother's keeper? That's not the answer, right? That's not the answer. And he says, I don't know where my brother is. And God turns to him and in trembling says, the blood of your brother cries out to me from the ground, right, from which you were made. And so Cain begins to tremble in himself, thinking he's about to get smitten. He's about to get killed by the Lord on high. And God turns and says, yeah, that's not my way. Mine is a way of mercy. And even in this weakness, in this crime, in this destitution, still does your body have dignity. I will mark it with the sign. Right? He marks Cain with a seal so that he is protected in the public sphere. The dignity of the sinful body, or of the sinner. You know the story of the adulteress, right? The woman caught in adultery and so on and so forth, right? And what happens, Jesus says, and he's right there, of course, he says, you with sin, right? You without sin, rather. Be the first to cast the stone. And one by one, the stones are dropped and they leave. And Jesus is now left alone and says to the woman, who condemns you? She says, none. And he says, nor do I. Sinful, yes. Dignity is still there, still intact. Wounded, perhaps, but still intact. The dignity of the other, I don't want to dwell on the Good Samaritan, but reread the Good Samaritan and realize that in our tradition also, there's this notion that the other's body also has dignity. This is something we struggle with. The body that looks different, the body that is other, the body that is foreign, also dignified. Let me just pause here. Old age. This is what I study, and so this is beautiful to me from Isaiah. Listen to me, O house of Jacob, all the remnant of the house of Israel, who have been born by me from your birth, carried from the womb, even to your old age, I am he. Even when you turn gray, I will carry you. I have made and I will bear. I will carry and I will save. I've read this a few times with elderly patients who find themselves alone, which is often the case. But what does the culture around us say? You start losing your functions, you start losing your abilities. I was in Target. Oh, am I allowed to say that? I was at a store the other day with my wife because we have 5 greeting cards in Canada, but you have thousands, and we are always spending hours. I spend hours instead of grading in front of them, laughing and crying over some of these. That's how we spend our time, and our children are wondering where we are. But here's an example. And they're funny. Don't get me wrong. But just look at the greeting cards here. Another birthday. Well, look in the mirror. Do you see wrinkles? Do you see gray hairs? Of course you don't. Your eyesight's gone. Happy birthday, Mom. I could say that as a Christian ethicist. I would be crucified for having given this to my mother, right? There's something terrible about the ageist bent of some of these things. You're 50. Oh my gosh, as I approach these ages, I cringe. But you look so natural and lifelike. Happy birthday. It's so interesting how, again, this is ageist, clearly. I just saw a card for a 21-year-old, and the candles were on the cake, and it was on fire, right? And there was a fire engine and so on and so forth. I'm like, really, though? Really, right? There's a certain notion about aging and function that really takes to its cusp. Finally, as we come to the close of this, there is dignity in death. This whole debate over euthanasia and so on and so forth. I was interviewed once about the case of Brittany Maynard. Do you know of Brittany Maynard? She was a Californian, if I remember, a young woman in her 20s, just got married, beautiful woman, master's degree, and she had a bachelor's in education, psychology, a master's in education, just got married, was delighted. Long story short, had a few headaches, went to the doctor, and was given 6 months because she had an advanced brain tumor. Your world stops, and it really does stop, right? When you realize that at the end of the day, we are woundable. I was interviewed because she signed on to Death with Dignity, the movement in Oregon, and she said, I found out what my life is going to look like in 6 months, and I'm not interested. I'm not interested in gaining the weight and suffering constantly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to do that. So I was phoned up by a certain journal, a well-known journal in the country while I was at Emory, and they said, hey, is this Professor Labrecque? I said, yes. Are you the Catholic? I said, yeah. Yes, I am the church. And they said, oh, good. Good. I'm like, oh. Tell me, why does the Catholic Church not believe in dying with dignity? I said, I'm sorry, what is this concern? What is the concern here? And they, gave me the context, and I said, forgive me, but you are sorely mistaken. And she said, I'm sorry, you're for dying with dignity? I said, absolutely, we invented it. She said, I am not following. I'm like, oh no, we invented dying with dignity. We invented this whole idea of accompanying the dying to the very, very end. In fact, we have ancient manuscripts that used to teach people, because priests and cardinals were dying during the plague, for instance, and people were freaking out, wondering, they were worried that they were not going to have priests and deacons and bishops at their side when they were dying. So manuscripts were written by the monastics to help people, short kind of texts on how to die well. We call this the ars moriendi, or the art of dying, that were produced to help people. And if you couldn't read, don't worry, there were pictures that they had to go along with it to help you die well. And like this whole dignity, and there's a chapter given on how to behave at the bedside of the dying. These are centuries old. And I'm like, yeah, we've done that for centuries. The thing is, we have a different definition of dignity than you do. Right? It starts with the person. Do you see that? And finally, there's dignity. This is a Caravaggio. There is dignity in the life after death. There's dignity in the post-mortem body. And this is why we're also interested in not just when you're living, but also what happens with the body when it dies. We have rules about these kinds of things, right? And there's something very interesting about the glorified body and what that might mean. If you ask tiny children to draw pictures of the glorified, of what paradise looks like and the resurrection, all that kind of thing, there's always a McDonald's and water slides there, always. And I always think, oh, that's either good marketing or I need to work hard here, or I never know what it is. But let's close with some of this. Ours is the emeritus cardinal of Philadelphia, said that ours is a sexually wounded culture. Isn't that an interesting expression? A sexually wounded culture that thinks of the body as something commodified, material, and desperately reduced. It is just stuff. And Pope Francis speaks of the culture of disposability. Have you ever heard him speak about this, the culture of waste? He laments the fact that we are very, very quick to dispose, not just of stuff. We waste so much stuff. We hyper-consume and we waste all kinds of stuff. But we also do that with certain persons, with certain human beings who just don't seem to count anymore. They're either institutionalized or thrown or just kind of given up, abandoned, whatever it might mean. And he says we need to return to this notion of dignity, of personhood, and remind ourselves as a people what this all means. This is what Christians are called to do: to recognize the dignity of others, the dignity of the body of others, starting first from a place of love and in solidarity with the woundable. The word vulnerable comes from the Latin word vulnerabilis. It means woundable. Guess what? When I go out and tend to the poor and so on and so forth, when we do that, it's great. You know, we're tending to the poor, to the vulnerable. But guess who's tending? The vulnerable. We're all vulnerable. We're all woundable. When my mother was diagnosed with colon cancer last year, and I was at home when she called me at my desk when I was at the top of my career, when everything was going well, and she called and said, "I thought I had a stomach bug. I have 4th-degree cancer." I was woundable. Not to say at any moment be ready. I'm saying the fact that at any moment we should be ready because we're fragile and delicate and woundable should remind you that the person next to you is also. The guy who cut you off on the 75, 85, 90, on 85, I always put the in front of it, 85, 75, that makes you so mad and probably was an idiot for having done that, don't get me wrong, may have been rushing back to his wife who was expecting, may have just gotten a call that somebody was dying in the family, may have just been unemployed. We are quick to not start from a place of love. I want to just give you a story. Is that okay? And then we'll call this to a close so that we can take some questions and you can go to your children who are hiding somewhere here. When I was 19 and lifted, and Philip has heard this story 100 times. When I was 19 and made director of my faith education, I told my bishop that he made a grave mistake, that I was still eating sand and tying my shoes with Velcro and so on and so forth. And he said, "Cory, don't say that." And I remember putting on my snazziest jogging suit on the first day, carried my Bible with my penny loafers, and made my way to the diocese, to my office. I didn't even know an office, my goodness. I sat in the office, and in that first week, I got a phone call. A woman said, "Are you the sacrament guy?" It's always that, "Are you the blank guy?" "Are you the sacrament guy?" I said, "Yeah, I'm the sacrament guy." She said, "My daughter is ready for First Communion." I said, "Wonderful, what's her name?" "You know, Cory, I've been away from the church for 10 years. I said, "I'm sorry to hear that. What's your daughter's name?" She said, "Do you want to hear why I've been away?" I'm like, "No, that's not a requirement for the sacraments. What is your child's name?" She said, "Well, 10 years ago, I gave birth to my firstborn. And my firstborn died 3 hours after delivery of something nobody saw coming. And somebody, and I don't remember the detail, it's not important, somebody she recognized as a Catholic or whatever, it doesn't matter, came up to her in those hours, said, 'Aren't you a Catholic?' She said, 'Yes.' And this is not what I thought I was going to hear next. 'Don't you guys believe that children who die without baptism have a hard time?' And she pondered that and thought, 'Is that what we believe?' And left the church. How could she mourn in a church that believes that there is flame for the innocent who are born right under the stain of original sin? And she wept on the phone. And I said to her, 'Ma'am, I'm 19, in my weeping, I'm 19, I'm an imposter in the diocese. I'm a servant of Mother Church, but I know nothing except my catechism. I know that the catechism teaches, I believe it's 1261. The catechism teaches this, ma'am.'" That's very Southern, but I'm sure I didn't say that. "Children who die without baptism are entrusted to the infinite mercy of God. Period." And she wept for another few minutes and then said, "Tracy Raymond is my daughter's name." And off it went. Not to tell you, the servant of God in your midst, not at all. That's starting, and I don't think I realized it, but that's starting from a place of love and not the, "Why didn't you know more about your tradition to have protected yourself? You would have been in the comfort of your community in your days of mourning." That would have been my first response, but it wasn't. It was the, "Oh my gosh, that's awful. Let me bind to you in my woundedness too." I think that's our calling. So this is what we are called to do. We are called to weep first for those who are woundable, for the bodies that are wounded. Pope Francis said this in Lampedusa, which is a place just off the coast of Sicily. He said, "In this globalized world, we have fallen into globalized indifference. We have become used to the suffering of others. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't concern me. It's none of my business. We are a society which has forgotten how to weep. Let us ask the Lord for the grace to weep over our indifference, to weep over the cruelty of our world, of our own hearts. Today we hear you asking, Father, 'Adam, where are you?' That's what he asked when he was walking in the garden. We are asked to pray, of course, for the woundable, for the wounded, and we're asked to act for the wounded body. You know this one from the great Carmelite mystic, Spanish Carmelite mystic, Teresa of Avila, Saint Teresa of Avila. Christ has no body but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks, compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which he blesses all. And as Christians, you and I are called to the bedside of that woman in the Alzheimer's ward who has no one. You are called to the body of one that looks like a shell of what it used to be. You are called to that body. You are called to the body of the homeless person who's dirty, who you would normally cross the street, let alone touch. You are called to anoint that body. You and I are. We are called to embrace that woman who just lost her child. Or that man who was just told that his son is now diagnosed with cancer. You are called to embrace those bodies. You and I are called, right, to be the balm of mercy to the four corners of the globe, to be God's healing presence in the here and now, to bodies in the here and now. Is that okay? The end. Thank you. That's fine.